Hello, and thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation. I'll be discussing the findings of my case study on Florida's Stop Woke Act and what it reveals about legislative ambiguity and public administration. Florida's Stop Woke Act is often discussed as a political or legal issue, but my research approached it from a different perspective. Rather than asking whether the law was politically right or wrong, I wanted to understand how one piece of legislation evolved into a much broader administrative implementation problem. I chose this topic because I experienced many of these changes firsthand. I'm a graduate of Florida's public university system. My daughter currently attends one of Florida's public middle schools, and I taught U.S. history in a Florida public school while these policies were being implemented. Those experiences made me interested in understanding how legislation can affect public institutions long after it is enacted. As I began researching the case, I found that the more interesting question was not whether the Stop Woke Act was constitutional. Instead, I wanted to know how an ambiguously drafted law could create administrative implementation failure. My research showed that what began as one statute gradually expanded through agency rulemaking, litigation, funding restrictions, curriculum changes, and administrative oversight. By the end of the process, the implementation system had become much larger than the original legislation itself. The story begins with House Bill 7, also known as the Individual Freedom Act or the Stop Woke Act. Signed into law in 2022, the legislation prohibited instruction or training that promoted or compelled belief in certain concepts involving race, color, sex, or national origin. However, the law also stated that those topics could still be discussed if they were presented objectively and without endorsement. The problem was that those terms were never clearly defined. As a result, universities and public administrators were left trying to determine exactly what the legislature intended and what compliance actually required. Those uncertainties appeared almost immediately. Within months of the law taking effect, federal courts issued preliminary injunctions blocking portions of the workplace training and higher education provisions. From a public administration perspective, this was an important moment because it demonstrated that administrators had been asked to implement standards that the legislature had never fully explained. Instead of simply carrying out policy, they were forced to interpret it. The litigation did not stop implementation. Instead, the state changed its approach. Florida enacted Senate Bill 266, the Board of Governors adopted additional regulations, and public universities began revising curriculum requirements and institutional policies. One of the most visible changes occurred when Principles of Sociology was removed from the approved general education core curriculum. Universities also reviewed and modified additional courses as they worked to comply with new state directives. During that process, an administrator at Florida International University described the experience as flying a little blind, a statement that illustrates the uncertainty surrounding implementation. What stood out most during my research was that the original legislation had evolved into something much larger than a single law. Agencies, governing boards, universities, and eventually the courts all became involved in determining how the policy would actually operate. The statute was only the starting point. The implementation process became the real story. The concepts we studied in this course helped explain why this happened. The politics administration distinction argues that elected officials create policy while administrators implement it. In this case, that distinction became blurred because administrators were required to define statutory language that legislators had left unresolved. Public administrators were no longer simply implementing policy, they were helping determine what the law meant in practice. The case also illustrates government or non market failure. Public higher education exists because it provides benefits that extend beyond individual students, making it an important public good. Instead of strengthening that public good, implementation redirected public resources toward compliance efforts, litigation, and administrative restructuring. Those costs were ultimately borne by universities, faculty, students, and taxpayers. Organization theory also helped explain the case. Authority shifted away from traditional faculty governance and toward governing boards and state agencies. At the same time, research documented increased faculty departures from Florida's public universities, suggesting that these administrative changes affected not only institutional operations but also employee behavior and retention. The case also raised questions about accountability. Responsibility became divided among legislators, administrative agencies, governing boards, universities, and the courts. As each institution attempted to resolve unanswered questions left by the statute, it became increasingly difficult to determine where responsibility for implementation truly belonged. However, the law also stated that those topics could still be discussed if they were presented objectively and without endorsement. The problem was that those terms were never clearly defined. As a result, universities and public administrators were left trying to determine exactly what the legislature intended and what compliance actually required. Based on this case, I identified three recommendations. First, legislation that delegates substantial authority to administrative agencies should undergo a formal implementation review before becoming law to identify ambiguous language and potential administrative challenges. Second, statutes should provide clearer guidance so agencies can implement policy consistently instead of interpreting legislative intent on their own. Finally, higher education institutions should preserve meaningful shared governance when curriculum decisions affect academic programs, ensuring that faculty expertise remains part of the decision-making process. Overall, this project changed the way I think about public policy. Before taking this course, I tended to focus on whether I agreed with a policy's goals. Now I better understand that implementation is just as important as the policy itself. Florida's Stop Woke Act demonstrates how legislative ambiguity can reshape public administration long after a law is enacted. My research suggests that effective governance depends not only on the goals lawmakers pursue, but also on providing administrators with clear guidance for carrying those goals into practice. When that guidance is missing, the effects can spread throughout public institutions and ultimately affect the citizens those institutions are meant to serve.